All right, let's jump right in. Today we're diving into a sermon that asks a pretty tough question. Why is it that we sometimes lose the passion for the things we do? We're going to break down its ideas on how to find a motivation that actually lasts, and it all starts with something called fervent service.
So this whole idea really kicks off with one central question, and it's aimed right at you. Are you lagging behind in diligence, or are you fervent in spirit? It's a direct challenge, really, to how we approach our work, our commitments, everything, and it totally sets the stage for what we're about to unpack.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll define what this fervent service thing even means. Then, we'll look at the common problem of becoming, well, lukewarm. After that, we'll uncover the ultimate motivation that's offered as the solution, see how that actually applies to daily life, and finally, we'll tackle the really challenging idea of being a slave to the Lord.
All right, first things first. What exactly is this fervent service that we're supposed to be aiming for? Let's define the ideal that the source lays out for us. You know, the source paints this picture of an ideal state being fervent in spirit. It's basically the exact opposite of being lazy or just not caring. The imagery they use is of someone who is so motivated they actually want to run up the mountain. It's about having this internal fire, right? A passionate energy that drives everything you do. Okay, so that's the goal. But let's be real, what's the reality for most of us? The source is very aware that this passion can fade, and that can lead to a state it calls being lukewarm. So let's diagnose that problem. And look, the sermon gets it. People who start out on fire for something don't always stay that way. They can become, and this is the word it uses, lukewarm. And that's a state the text seriously warns against. But the real question is, why? Why does this happen? And you know what? The reasons it gives for this burnout, they're going to sound super familiar. We're talking about being criticized, dealing with rumors, feeling like nobody appreciates what you do, or just being plain exhausted from working so hard. These aren't some abstract failings. They are real-world pressures that would make anyone want to just pull back and say, you know what, I'm done trying so hard. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the fix? Well, that brings us right to our third section, finding what it calls the ultimate motivation.
So the whole solution really hinges on this one passage, and I want you to really pay attention to that one phrase, by the mercies of God. Because that little phrase, it completely changes the game. Your motivation is no longer about getting applause or trying to avoid criticism. It's framed as a response to something you've already been given.
So getting that fire back isn't just a switch you flip. It's laid out here as this deliberate, three-step mental process. It starts with consideration. You have to actively think about this idea of mercy. That then leads to the action of presenting yourself as a living sacrifice. And the results of all that is transformation, what the text calls a renewing of your mind.
And this right here, this is really the core of the whole psychological shift. The argument is that if you want to avoid burnout, your drive has to come from a place of internal gratitude. If you're always relying on someone else to give you a pat on the back, well, you're setting yourself up for a fall, because that can disappear in a second. Okay, so that's the theory. But how does this internal shift actually play out in the real world, like on a Tuesday afternoon? This brings us to the practical stuff, service in your daily life.
Now, this quote is really interesting because it's used to connect these big spiritual ideas to something we all do, our jobs. I mean, the argument here is pretty powerful. If this way of thinking applied to actual slaves doing the absolute worst jobs you can imagine, then it could for sure apply to us in our modern work lives. It basically reframes the work itself as an act of service. So this boils down to two really practical things you can do every day. First, change how you see your job. See it as a form of service and just work hard at it. And second, you've got to find and use your unique talents, what the source calls your spiritual gifts. This could be anything really. Teaching, encouraging, organizing, creating. The idea is when you use the gifts you naturally have, the work actually gives you energy instead of draining it from you.
Now, the sermon actually brings up a really common objection here. You know, that feeling of, hey, I'm just not one of those super zealous, high-energy people. And the response is pretty clear. This has nothing to do with your personality type. Everybody is passionate about something, whether it's sports or politics or their family. The call here is to channel that same capacity for passion towards this idea of service. Okay, now we're getting to what is probably the most challenging, maybe even uncomfortable idea in the whole sermon, and it's all built around this really provocative metaphor, being a slave to the Lord.
So, this question is asked point blank, And yeah, it's designed to make you stop and think. That word, slave, it's a tough one. It's harsh, it's loaded with all kinds of terrible history, so why on earth would they use that specific word?
Well, to explain the mindset, the sermon points to a parable. The idea here is about having a sense of duty, an obligation, that's not about looking for a thank you or some kind of reward. It frames service not as some extra thing you do to get bonus points, but as the fundamental thing you're just supposed to do.
So here's how the sermon tries to reframe this really difficult idea. The argument is that, like it or not, everyone is serving something. So the choice isn't really between being a slave and being free, it's about choosing your master. On one side, you have a loving master who offers a rewarding inheritance, and on the other, a self-serving tyrant who couldn't care less about you and leads to condemnation.
And that really brings us to the final takeaway, which, interestingly enough, comes from a Bob Dylan song. You gotta serve somebody. So the ultimate question this analysis leaves us with isn't if you're going to serve, but who or what.